Today we're going to talk about parallelograms. The definition of a parallelogram is that it's a quadrilateral with both pairs of opposite sides parallel. So the only thing that we know from the definition of a parallelogram is that the opposite sides are parallel. The other definition we need to be familiar with is consecutive angles. And we think of consecutive as two things that come right after another. That's the same thing consecutive angles are. Angles of a polygon that share a side. There are a couple parallelogram theorems we need to know, and these theorems tell us more about parallelograms. So the first one, theorem 6.3, says if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then its opposite sides are congruent. So now we know that the opposite sides are parallel and congruent. The second theorem says that if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then its consecutive angles are supplementary. So our consecutive angles A and B, if we add them together, they equal 180. Theorem 6.5 says if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then its opposite angles are congruent. So we now know that its opposite angles are congruent and its consecutive angles are supplementary. So we know two things about angles and two things about sides. There are a few more theorems about parallelograms. So theorem 6.6 says if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then its diagonals bisect each other. Remember, bisect means to cut in half, so its diagonals cut each other in half. That doesn't mean all the pieces are equal, it means the halves are equal. And then the last theorem, which has to do with the idea of parallelograms, but actually deals more with parallel lines, says if three or more parallel lines cut off congruent segments on one transversal, then they cut off congruent segments on every transversal. So if we look at our diagram, what this is saying is I have three parallel lines, and this is a transversal. It cuts this transversal into two equal pieces. Therefore, it cuts this side also into equal pieces. Not necessarily that the two sides are the same, but that the lengths on the transversal are equal. So there's been a lot of information in this video in just a short amount of time, and I want to make sure we talk about what are the properties of a parallelogram, because it's going to be important as you start looking at shapes and classifying them. So first of all, we know the opposite sides are parallel. That comes from our definition. Then we know that the opposite sides are also congruent. We know the consecutive angles are supplementary. We know opposite angles are congruent. And we know that the diagonals bisect each other. There's a lot of properties of parallelograms. And if you look at our diagram, there's a lot of markings. Those markings all show the different properties that we have of parallelograms. And that's it. We're going to talk more about parallelograms in the upcoming days, but make sure that you know those properties of parallelograms.